In the early 1980s, there was this British TV series called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In one part of this show, I mean, it had a very cult following, but it was popular enough that it actually won a couple awards. But in one part of one of the episodes of this, there was this conversation between a couple of guys and this supercomputer named Deep Thought. And this supercomputer had been built for the explicit purpose of finding out the answer to the big question of life, the universe, and everything, right? That was its entire purpose. And it took 7.5 million years to come up with an answer. And it finally has an answer to this question. And I want to show you guys the clip of Deep Thought's answer to this question. So you guys go ahead and watch this.
Deep Thought is about to speak.
Good evening.
Good evening. Oh, Deep Thought, do you have you?
An answer for you? Yes, I have.
There really is one?
There really is one.
To everything? The secret of the universe, the great question of life and everything?
Yes,
And are you ready to give it to us?
I am.
Now?
Now.
Wow.
Though I don't think you're going to like it.
It doesn't matter. We must know it.
Now.
Yes.
All right.
Well,
You're really not going to like it.
tell us.
The answer to the great question
Yes.
of life, the universe, and everything
Yes.
is
Yes.
42. It was a tough assignment.
42? Is that all you've got to show for 7.5 million years' work?
I think the problem is that you've never actually known what the question is.
But it was the great question. The ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything.
Yes, but what actually is it?
Well, just everything. You know, everything.
Exactly. You have to know what the question actually is in order to know what the answer means.
If this show had been made like a couple thousand years earlier, probably could have saved Solomon a whole lot of time, about 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes, right? He could have just written Ecclesiastes chapter 1, the whole meaning to life, everything, the universe, all of it is 42. Now let's jump ahead and read Song of Songs, right? That's where y'all want to read anyway. But that's not quite how it happened, you know? You can see from these two men's reaction that answer was very confusing, wasn't it? Like, it just doesn't seem to make sense. 7.5 million years spent computing the answer to the question of life, and it comes down to a nonsensical number, 42. But they're not the only ones who are searching for this same answer. In fact, that's what the whole of the book of Ecclesiastes is about. It's an attempt to find meaning and significance in life. So let's read Ecclesiastes 1. We're going to read verses 12 through 18 together. It says, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. What is crooked cannot be straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. And I said to myself, see, I have amassed wisdom far beyond those who are over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly, and I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. For with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. What the hitchhikers used a supercomputer to do, the teacher here in Ecclesiastes is going to use wisdom, pleasure, and work to come up with an answer. In fact, that's this whole little section that we're starting tonight, chapter 1, verse 12 through 2, verse 26, that we're going to cover over the next 3 weeks. He uses this idea of exploring wisdom, pleasure, and work to try and make sense of life. Now tonight, we're just going to focus on the wisdom side of that, and then we will cover pleasure and work over the next couple of weeks. But we're going to see tonight in a real short amount of time that there are 4 difficult realities, 4 harsh realities that wisdom introduces into our lives. And he breaks this into 2 different parts. There's the concept of knowledge or information and accumulating information, knowledge. And then there's also the morality side of things. In fact, some philosophers would maintain that is kind of a very simple definition of wisdom, that wisdom is where knowledge and morality intersect. Knowing information along with knowing how to make good decisions about that information is ultimately what leads us to wisdom. So first, he applies this concept to of his mind to exploring everything, right? He wants to know as much as he can possibly know. And from the start, the teacher lets us know that he's not real happy with the conclusion, right? I mean, that's a pretty pessimistic outlook, to say the least, that what a terrible business, what a bad business, what an evil thing that this is that we have to deal with in life, right? What a miserable existence God has given to us, he effectively says. Like, I've pursued all the knowledge, I've learned all of the things, I know more than anybody else in the world, and let me tell you, it's not looking pretty. Like, this is not an okay place to be. Your CSB Bible says it's a miserable task to keep us occupied. So clearly the teacher is not very happy with where this pursuit has led him. And this is our first harsh reality of the night in verses 12 and 13, that trying to explain the meaning of everything will ultimately rob you of joy. But how much of our time do we spend analyzing our own situations, trying to think of what went wrong or what we could have done differently? We think on those things until our brains hurt, don't we? But all it ends up doing, it makes us angrier. It leads us down depressing paths, or at least it leaves us less fulfilled, right? The more we think about it, the angrier we get. But we love this phrase that everything has a purpose, right? We use that phrase a lot. And I do think that there is some truth in that, but that mentality can also lead us down a devastating path. That when we spend so much of our time trying to discover the purpose behind that one event that happened to us, that we are trying to live our lives looking backwards. You know, when you're driving down the road and you go past a wreck, right? What do we typically do, right? We're driving along and we see a wreck, and as we're driving, we rubberneck, right? We do this and we watch that wreck, and maybe we're trying to figure out what happened. So the whole time we're watching it, we're like, okay, this car probably pulled out in front of this one, and maybe that didn't work. So we're analyzing this whole situation, when if we don't stop doing that and get our eyes back in front of us, we're going to be the next wreck that police officer is going to have to just jump up the road and take care of yours, right? Because we're not paying attention to what's in front of us. We spend so much of our time analyzing what's behind us, and I think a lot of us live our lives that way. Our entire lives are spent like this. when we're not even paying attention to what's happening in front of us and where we are supposed to be going. This is an unhappy business. Some of your translations will take that verse, that this is an unhappy business that God has given us. You are never going to find a satisfactory answer to why these things happen to you, to why you're in that situation that you're in. And we're going to spend so much of our time focused on the past, we are going to bypass a lot of joy and a lot of opportunities in our present and in our future because we're so focused on the futility of finding meaning from something in our past. Now, the teacher also tells us that he has explored everything under the sun. He has seen it all. And here's his big takeaway. What's crooked can't be made straight. And what you can't count what isn't there. Now, here's what that means. Some of your circumstances can't be corrected. This is a harsh reality that we need to let this sink in a little bit, that sometimes life just is what it is. And there is nothing that you can do to fix it, as much as we want to fix it. In fact, one of the core tenets of moving forward, or it's also one of the stages of grief recovery, right, is acceptance. It's also the first part of the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to what? Accept the things I cannot change, right? Acceptance is a huge part of how we move forward. One of the most life-altering practices that you can do is to accept the reality that some things just can't be fixed. Some of life's problems cannot be fixed. And it's this realization that the teacher has come to. And perhaps, though, the answer isn't in knowledge. That we're never going to amass enough information to make everything in our lives make sense, right? We can probably grant that. We know we're not going to have all the answers to everything. So maybe the answer isn't in knowledge, but maybe as we look at the other side of that wisdom dichotomy that I presented a minute ago, that maybe it's in morality. Maybe the answer to life, the finding the real meaning of life comes from knowing right and wrong, from being a good person, right? Maybe that's where it is. Well, in verse 17, he says that he has applied his mind to knowledge, but then he also says he has applied his mind to madness and folly. Now, this doesn't mean what we think of when we think of madness, right? That someone has gone mad, as in they're now insane, right? They've had a mental breakdown and they're not in their right mind. That's not what he means here. Nor does he mean being stupid, as if he's saying, hey, look, I've tried being really smart, I've tried being really dumb, and neither one gives us an answer to this question, although I'm certain that is true. Instead, he is talking about morality here. When we see madness and folly, when we see those words used in the Old Testament, it's in connection with disobedient behavior of those who are not following God's instructions. They're making unwise or foolish decisions. And the teacher is not only pursuing knowledge here, he's also exploring the difference between right and wrong. And that introduces our next harsh reality, that being a good person isn't enough to make sense of life. But how many people use this as the metric of a life well lived? I'm a good person. I didn't do anything really terrible, so that means my life must mean something, right? That's the ultimate goal, is just to be a good person. That's ultimately what matters. Now, obviously, I am in favor of everybody being a good person, even though I know several who missed that memo, right? Like, we are in favor of people being good people. But morality in itself doesn't get us any closer to making sense of life. The meaning of our existence isn't connected with you being a good person. That still leaves more unanswered questions. In fact, one of the biggest challenges of the pursuit of morality is that it isn't enough to protect you from folly. Look at Solomon himself. He's a perfect example of this. Right? Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, right? We equate wisdom with King Solomon because he was so wise until we get to 1 Kings chapter 11. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it tells us that Solomon, he liked the ladies. And he liked the foreign ladies. And so he went out and he grabbed himself 700 wives, most of whom were from foreign lands. So he married women from foreign lands, something that God expressly forbid them to do. And then he wavered and he began to worship some of the idols that these women would bring into his lives. And so 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 6 says, so Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Wisdom, madness, folly, right, wrong, good, evil. This too, the teacher says in Ecclesiastes 1:17, is a pursuit of the wind. This too is chasing smoke. And the final harsh reality for us today is found in verse 18. When he says, with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. You know, the more that you try to figure out why the world is broken, the more frustrating life becomes. Now, wait a minute, though. I thought knowledge was a good thing, right? Pastor Michael tells us all the time to spend time learning, to think deeply, to become a lifelong learner. Knowledge is supposed to be a good thing, but now here you are telling me that the more I do that, the more sad I'm going to be. No thanks, right? But that is a kind of what I am getting at. Because this is what the teacher tells us, that to truly understand life is to understand tragedy. The more you try to understand it, the more it robs you of joy, sure. And there are more things in life that you can't control than things that you can. And being a good person isn't an answer that satisfies the soul. So the more you think on these things, the more you realize the severity of the human condition. And it's heartbreaking. So yeah, the more you apply your mind to this, the more sorrow you begin to experience. I can think of no more perfect example of this than a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. By many accounts, he's one of the most important figures in human history where philosophy is concerned. He was as anti-Christian as they come, but he was also one of the deepest thinkers humanity has ever seen. And his pursuit of knowledge, much like the teachers in Ecclesiastes, led him to some pretty dark places. And most of us have probably never heard of Friedrich Nietzsche, other than maybe one quote of his that's pretty famous, and that's the quote that we're going to look at. And this quote is famous second only to the fame of his mustache. I mean, take a look at this thing. That's something else, right? But here's what Nietzsche said. He said, God is dead, and God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet known has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean in ourselves? What festivals of atonement or sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? His claim was that Judeo-Christian values and our concept of God no longer holds merit. It doesn't answer the questions that it set out to, in his opinion. So Nietzsche entered his own pursuit, and rather persuasively to many people, I might add, he deconstructed about 2,000 years of biblical thought and Western philosophy. Now, there are a lot of atheists out there, particularly in the realm of philosophy, right? We all know this. That's not surprising. But most of them, whether they want to admit it or not, cling to some sort of deity. There is something greater than themselves that they hold to. But Nietzsche in realizing, as he says here in this quote, that we ourselves must fill this gap, Nietzsche was looking for something within ourselves to do this. But he also wasn't really willing to accept the philosophical idea called nihilism, which is that everything has absolutely no meaning and there's no purpose in life whatsoever. He wasn't there either. He didn't want to accept that. And so he sought out this pursuit, trying to find the meaning of life in a world completely void of God. And as he stared into that abyss and as he tried to process what that could possibly look like, and being the deep thinker that he was, and he applied his mind to this concept in a completely godless framework, it eventually drove him mad. That Nietzsche himself suffered a irreversible mental breakdown. Because I think probably more clearly than most anybody else who has ever lived, he saw the bleakness of life without God. He saw the darkness of a broken world with no hope, and it drove him crazy. You know, I think if we're not careful, and if we don't have a couple of caveats in the way, just like the teacher of Ecclesiastes predicted, the more deeply he thought about life, the more deeply he experienced sorrow. And we too might expect something similar. You know, the more we attempt to make sense of life, the more we come to the realization that tragedy, that pain, that sorrow exist. And sometimes there's not an answer to it. Sometimes it just is what it is. And we'll drive ourselves crazy trying to find an answer to it. So what are we to do then? How are we to dig ourselves out of this very depressive hole that I just put us in? Well, in a sense, we don't. Pursuing the Christian life is in many respects pursuing a life of deep sorrow. The Bible calls Jesus himself a man of sorrows because of the suffering that he would endure. And following him, being his disciple, being his learner, means that we too are going to endure suffering, much of which has very little explanation. But I can tell you this. All of the despair that these harsh realities invoke are completely overshadowed by the love of Jesus. When we look at what Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16 through 19, and Riss, you can go ahead and begin making your way up here now. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says, I pray that God may grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power in your inner being through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted firmly and established in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and width and height and depth of God's love, and to know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So yes, pursue knowledge, chase after wisdom, be a good person, all of those things. But know that making sense of life is not to be found in them. There are times that life just simply doesn't make sense. And when you don't understand why you're going through the things that you're doing, why you are experiencing the tragedy in your life that you are, and as you think about it and you're trying to make sense of it, and the best you can come up with is 42, I want you to go back to this passage in Ephesians 3. May you be filled with the fullness of God because of Christ's love that surpasses all of that knowledge. Well, guys, as we go tonight, I want to take us back to Ephesians chapter 3 one more time, when right after Paul says these words that we just read in those verses a minute ago about how the love of Christ surpasses knowledge, and that he wants us to be in the fullness of God and live our lives in that way. He says this, and I want you guys to stand, and I want you to, as I just read these words to you directly from God's word, just let this soak over you, and let this be an encouragement to you this week for whatever lies ahead for you this week, whatever challenges you may be facing, whatever work obstacles are in front of you, whatever tasks are on your to-do list this week. Let these words from God's Bible speak to you tonight. It says, "Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." You guys have a great week.